And I would like to thank the moderator, Michel, who is a producer of Dynamo Capital, has been in the producer of the Direction of Desire in HBO, and since Barcelona has done a lot of co-productions with the Dynamo Capital. So Michel is going to explain a lot about Niv Fichman, who's going to be the person who's going to be here in this scenario. Let me welcome Carol Brabant. She's director of Telefilm Canada. It's the one that is leader in the audiovisual. We have also the director of the National Film Board of Canada and other representatives that she's going to introduce. Thank you very much, and in name of Pro Imagen and the Chamber of Commerce of Bogota, we welcome the people who are looking at us in Steam. Gracias. Buenas tardes.
This is Telefilms Canada's first visit to Colombia, so it is my great pleasure to begin by thanking Pro Imagen for organizing this focus on Canada at the Bogota Audiovisual Market. Muchas gracias en particular a su director Claudia Triana de Vargas por esta invitación y a Juliana Ortiz y Andrés Bayona por su colaboración. They're both very fantastic. Telefilm Canada is a national organization dedicated to the cultural, commercial, and industrial success of Canada's audiovisual industry. Through its various funding and promotion programs, Telefilm supports dynamic companies and creative talent, and we have a lot of those in Canada, at home and around the world. This event is an opportunity for producers from both our countries to talk about our respective markets, the funding and co-production opportunities, as well as to look at some of the challenges that we face. Niv Fichman, one of Canada's most experienced producers in international deal-making, will be the first to tell you this afternoon that partnering with Canada makes perfect business sense. From the Red Violin to The Boy Who Smells Like Fish, presented yesterday, not to mention Silk and the critically acclaimed Blindness, Niv has worked with many producers around the globe in Europe, Asia, and Latin America. It is also my pleasure to introduce the other Canadian industry players who will be with us for the next 3 days. And please stand up for the one who are here. Of course, the other one won't be hearing me when I name you. Monique Simard, National Film Board of Canada. Anne-Marie Gélina, I know she's arrived today, but I don't think she's in the room. Carmen Garcia, Argus Film. Nicolas Como, 1976 production. Kevin Tierney, but I haven't seen him. He's from Part X Pictures. He's arrived, but he's not here yet. Yannick Letourneau, Peripheria, also arrived today, so you're going to be having the chance to meet him tomorrow. Mercedes Alvarez, Hola Entertainment. Josette Gauthier, Triplex Film. Sarah Spring, Parabola Film. And, oh, there you are. Elizabeth Bradshaw, Hot Docs Canadian International Documentary Festival. I look forward to discovering opportunities of collaboration between our two countries and wish to all of you a very productive market. Enjoy the session. Muchas gracias por su atención.
Okay. We'd like to welcome then Niv Fichman, the producer from Rhombus Media.
You think I got the shoes to match the...
Well, welcome, Niv. Thank you very much for being here with us. And I think we could start, although Carol has already introduced a bit about your company. If you could tell us a little bit about Rhombus Media, about the films that you have been involved in, going to have the chance to see trailers from some of the most renowned films from your production company.
Great. Well, Rhombus started 35 years ago, I guess. Started with, we have 3 partners, and we started in film school. It's kind of a classic, crazy success story in the sense of a company that stays together. We started as film students. I was 19, and we're still together, the same 3 partners. And of course, like a marriage, you know, you go up and down, and sometimes you want to kill them. But I think now we're kind of at this plateau that I can't see that's ever going to, you know, end in terms of kind of leaving each other. I think the reason the success of longevity has remained is because of we have different interests. You know, I've kind of over the years become more of the producer. I started out as being one of the 3 of us were directors. In our first film, the 3 of us co-directed because we couldn't decide who would direct it. And then the other 2 have kind of stayed directors, mostly in the music and documentary area. My partner Barbara Willis-Sweet is now become one of the top directors of directing live music performances. She does a lot of the Metropolitan Opera stage performances that get, I'm sure it gets broadcast.
Yes, they get broadcast here as well.
Yeah, so she did, I think the world's most stressful job is to sit in front of 18 monitors and call live a show that you know is being beamed to, I think now it's like 2,500 cinemas around the world live. But she does that, and she's been doing that for the last 5 years. And the other one, Larry, is a documentary director.
But this is all in the feature film area? Do you do any television or any new media?
We do some television. We started actually by doing performing arts, mostly music, dance. You know, the Red Violin kind of emerged out of that, of doing films about music and dance. But now we do television. Larry does documentaries mostly in the end for television, although some of them are theatrical. But and then I do also some limited TV, dramatic TV series.
Okay. We're going to go now see then 3 trailers from some of the most renowned films. The first one we're going to see is Red Violin. Anything you would like to tell us about that?
Yeah, I guess Red Violin was a collaboration with director François Girard, who's a Montreal-based director. We started working with him on a TV, like a performance show with a very renowned Montreal-based performance group called Carbon 14, and a brilliant director, his name is Jules Maillet, who created this show. God, I guess it was in the late 80s now. And so we made that film in 1990, and then after that we made with François a film called 32 Short Films about Glenn Gould, which was quite
an amazing
renowned.
film, which is very highly recommended.
Which was my first feature film as a producer. And then from that grew the Red Violin. We worked with another longtime collaborator, Don McKellar, who wrote the screenplay for the Red Violin and also for 32 short films about Glenn Gould, and still working with Don these days. Our next, we're doing a TV series together with Kim Cattrall that we're shooting in September. So
he was an actor in The Boy Who Smelled Like Fish.
Yes, he was. Yeah, exactly. He played the father. You're right. Yeah, he's everywhere. He's an omnipresent, great artist.
Okay, so shall we see the Red Violin?
The last sale of the evening, the star of the night, the so-called Red Violin. Who will start us off?
Prophecy foretold of a masterpiece
Maestro.
that would be born of tragedy. It foretold of a journey that would call forth a prodigy.
These peoples from the Vales have given us some figures. So what we need now is a
professional opinion. You ever heard of the Red Violin?
You sure I have stories?
What you're saying is anyway true. People could get a little excited.
Destined to wander across the ages and never to rest.
Victoria, I need you.
Its song of seduction could inspire genius, but also betrayal.
Oh, sluttish muse. Who is she? Quiet!
This is the single most perfect acoustic machine I have ever seen.
While some would condemn its beauty, others would risk their lives to preserve it.
Is our little red violin the red violin?
Now, the time has come.
Guess I never thought I'd find it.
When it will reveal itself once more.
Here she is now, lot 72, the so-called Red Violin.
Its beauty bewitches. Its perfection astounds.
600,000.
Its mystery endures.
700,000. 1,100,000. 1,300,000. 2,400,000. So,
the Red Violin.
Wow, that is clearly an extremely ambitious production, shot in many countries. Was that a co-production?
It was a co-production with Italy, but in the other countries it was like a service.
Production services.
Yeah.
The other film that we're going to see a trailer of is Blindness. Blindness, which was based on the novel by Nobel Prize winner José Saramago. Blindness was a chance to work with a Latin American director, Fernando Meireles. How did that come about, and was that a co-production?
Yeah, it was a co-production, and again, the omnipresent Don McKellar, he wrote the screenplay for it. He's the one who actually found the novel. I mean, it's not something you find because it was so famous, but he read the novel when it first came out, and was very, very attracted to it and asked me to read it, and I read it, and so we decided that it was something that we should try to make as a film. And at the time, it was really, really hard to reach Saramago. He decided not to give the rights to anybody for any of his books because I learned later that he thought that cinema destroyed the imagination. And I guess when it comes to an author like that, it's probably true, because the imagination is so much more present and so much more limitless, I guess, when you're writing something, because every reader can interpret things in so many different ways, whereas cinema is, you see the image and it's there. But anyway, we persisted, probably out of naivete, because I think now I'd probably be a little bit more intimidated, but we did persist, and finally we got an appointment with him in his home in Lanzarote in the Canary Islands, and we spent 2 days together and talked about everything but the book.
But Meireles was already attached by that point?
No, Meireles this was 10 years before, or 8 years before, and it was just me and Don, and he finally said, after just out of the blue, he said, yes, I really like you guys, and go do it. And then Don went into this period of writing the script, which took literally like 8 years, because it's such a dark place, and he just had to get out of it. He made another film in the meantime, and lots of other things. And finally, we had a script that had such an ambition that we decided to look for, a director that would be able to, of course, to provide the vision for it, but also that would have the clout to get a certain kind of cast and give the film a certain budget level that it required in order to make it, a grand statement as we hoped it would be. And our first choice was Fernando. And it was weird. We got in touch with him through his producer of Constant Gardener, and the first thing we heard was that not only had he, I thought he would have heard of the book because he's Portuguese speaking and maybe he read it. So it turned out not only had he heard of it and read it, but he actually tried to option the rights to it. He really, really wanted to make that film, 8 years before, but we already had the rights. So there's a weird coincidence. It landed back on his desk, which of course can be good or bad because he had a vision for it, and if the script wasn't the same vision, it would be bad, it would be worse, but he really, really thought Don did a great job on it, and then he actually, the first thing he did was he asked Don to be part of it, and Don plays one of the main characters. He plays the thief, and he's there as well. Don should be here beside, he is actually right here, my friend Don. Yeah, so we
that was a co-production between which countries?
That was a production between Canada and Brazil. It was my first Latin American co-production, and it was, and also with Japan. And the reason Japan is because we'd worked with a producer in Japan on a previous project called Silk with Francois, and she really, really loved the book, and she joined the production. It was really basically a financial co-production with Japan.
Was it shot in Brazil?
It was shot partly in Brazil and partly in Canada. All the internal, the prison, the stuff that was in that terrible place, I was all in Canada, and all the exteriors were in São Paulo. But it was one of the most great experiences, and working in Brazil was great and gave me a huge hunger to work in Latin America. Up to that point, I really hadn't, I'd worked a lot in Europe. Of course, you start because it was classical music I started with, and so we started in Europe and then little kind of Japan because of, following music and following, Red Violin with China and whatever. So I really was concentrating on Asia and Europe, so I wasn't really thinking as much about Latin America, but because of that film, I've been really mostly concentrating on Latin America since then, which is why it's so great to be here.
Oh, great to have you. Let's see the trailer for Blindness.
Yes, it's a good day for singing a song, and it's a good day.
What's the matter? I can't see. I think I was infected by that patient I saw yesterday.
Tell me what you did.
Over 90% of the population has been infected with an epidemic of blindness. The white sickness is highly contagious. There are no visible signs of trauma or symptoms. There is no cure.
My fellow citizens, due to the gravity of the situation, our main obstacle is containment. May God help us all.
The only thing more terrifying than blindness is being the only one who can see.
Wow, still gives me the chills. Okay, we're going to have a chance to see the trailer for The Boy Who Smelled Like Fish, but I'm going to leave that for a little later because we're going to go into a little more detail in that film and how that co-production came about. I think if you don't mind, I'd like to go into if you could explain to us a little bit how the film institutions in Canada work, obviously Telefilm Canada, but I'm going to start to ask you a few questions as to how you structure co-productions, what are the requirements. As we said, we do have a co-production, an existing co-production agreement with Colombia. The terms of that agreement is very similar to co-production agreements around the world, where you have a minority co-producer has to be at least 20% in a two-party co-production. It would be 80-20, obviously, but there are also possibility, obviously, for co-productions involving more countries. So the first question would be, what are the requirements, essentially, for a film to be able to qualify for a co-production in Canada?
So you mean just
well, in terms of
technically,
well, financially, I understand that there has to be at least an investment of, from both countries in those percentages. I would understand that there's also have to be technical and crew and cast requirements in a similar percentage to that of the co-production.
Yeah, I mean, we have to separate kind of, and this is something that I think is important, that I'm speaking here with people that I've met already today, and I'm going to meet lots, I think a lot of you, over the next few days. So you have to separate, first of all, kind of the technical structure of it all, and then kind of what I think would drive it from the heart. So there's this cerebral, what's on the papers and what you can read on the website, and then what really drives it is what's from here, But so first you must understand the overall. So it's really, really simple. As you say, it's basically two countries. It could be three countries, but just for sake of ease, let's say two countries. So it has to be at least a 20% participation. Now you can't be scared by that, because let's say if it's a Canada-Colombia co-production, and let's say it's going to be a $5 million co-production, Colombia is not expected to raise $1 million, because if it's going to be a $5 million co-production, then presumably there's going to be money from other places. Perhaps there's an advance from a foreign sales agent, and that can be allocated accordingly to the sides. It can be, and often has been, Canada is very generous that way in terms of accepting things, as you can allocate a larger part of not only 20%, if it's going to be a $2 million MG, you don't have to say, oh, Colombia only gets 400, it could be more, it's like, so it's quite easy to structure that 20-80, I think, in terms of how it works, but it could be even a 50-50, whatever makes sense. I think what drives it more is the spend as opposed to the financing, because how are you going to allocate the spend? So in other words, you have to decide, is it going to be shot here? Is it going to be shot there? Is it going to be partly shot in two countries? Where's the post? Where do all the different creative positions come from? So if it is only a 20, eventually, if you want to bring a Colombian director, Colombian writer, and a full Colombian crew, then it's going to be very hard to make it a 20% Colombian co-production, because there's going to be more on the Colombian side. You see what I mean? So you have to kind of balance what will be the actual production. You have to take that first, or what you think it would be, and then in a way, then you kind of allocate, sort of superimpose on top of it the financing structure and the percentages. So that's kind of, and then where you get the money here, there are different ways to get the money. As we know, there's subsidies, there's the fund that you have, and
yes, there's sometimes television that can come in as co-producers.
Yeah, there's private funds.
There's private funding. There's tax incentives for investors.
Right.
There's.
I mean, it's really actually astonishing how much there is here. I think it's really great, and it's the same for me when I first went to Brazil. I was astonished to find, their system is actually incredibly generous towards production, and you can raise significant amounts of money, and as well in Mexico. They're actually very similar structures, where there's a diversion of taxes that people have to pay, they can actually put into, instead of paying it to the government as tax, they just can directly put it into cinema up to a certain percentage, and it works really, really well, and you know, so those countries have, you know, very, very significant, it can make very significant contributions to financing, you know, which is great. So that's basically kind of what you have to know from, you know, from the overall. But to me, the most important thing is, you know, what is the reason for a co-production? You know, what drives the co-production? Why would you do a co-production? And I think that's the thing that a lot of people kind of stumble on, because it's not a way for someone from Colombia to come to me and say, hey, can you give me money for my project? Because that's what, you know what I mean? Like you know, there has to be a reason why a Canadian producer would want to participate in a project. You know, it could be that, you know, the project has a Canadian part of the story, or that it needs to be shot in Canada, as The Boy Who Smells Like Fish was, or you know, from my perspective with Blindness, you know, we wrote a screenplay based on a book that could have been set anywhere. So, but it needed to be set in a big city. But we went to a Brazilian director, so we had I mean, that Blindness is a perfect co-production. It's a textbook co-production because, you know, it's a Portuguese book, so it's not even from the countries that ended up making the film. But, you know, we took a book. It was written by a Canadian screenwriter. It was given to a Brazilian filmmaker. We shot half, you know, a third, you know, I guess a third of it in Canada and 2/3 in Brazil, or let's say, you know, close to half, and then we posted in both countries. So there was kind of an equal split. The cast was split aside from the, you know, American actors that we had, and we got a chance to use quite a lot of them because the film was so big, so they allowed us a little bit more than normal. You know, aside from that, it was Brazilian and Canadian and Japanese, because there's a Japanese. It was actually an official Japanese co-production, and you know, and the technical positions were quite evenly split as well. Fernando brought some of his team with him, but we also had Canadian people, and so you know, we had a Canadian, for example, a Canadian sound mixer, post-production sound mixer. At the time in Brazil, there didn't exist a world quality studio for doing post-production sound. So Fernando asked that we send our sound technician to Brazil, and they designed a whole theater and built it for him under his specs. And then he mixed in it with a Brazilian co-mixer that then became Brazil's top mixer. You know, and that theater still is the top mixing theaters in Brazil right now. So, you know, there's a lot of collaboration, and so there was a reason for that co-production. It wasn't like I could go to Telefilm and say, this is a really Canadian film, you should support it to the maximum, and I could, Fernando or his team at O2 could go and say the same thing in Brazil. So there's imperative in both countries, both financially and culturally, to make this a co-production. I think that's really, really important for me as a producer from Canada, is to make a film that has, you know, an equal or at least a somewhat of an interest on the other side. Absolutely. So if I come to Colombia to make a film here, and I want to do it as a co-production, I would absolutely bring a film that has something to do with Colombia. I mean, I wouldn't come here with a film that's set in Japan about, you know, a person from Australia. You know, I'll go to those countries, you know, so it's really, really important to kind of keep that in mind, is why are you doing a co-production? You have to think of the other side. So.
Absolutely, no, I think that's a very important point that you raised, in the issue, sort of a cultural identification of some form on both parts. There have to be elements that culturally can attract an audience in both countries, at least. In that sense, you bring also the issue of spend, and the idea that I would assume that a lot of the projects that you may be seeing here are probably mostly set in Colombia and are difficult to conceive necessarily that may have a part that could be shot in Canada. Obviously, they may have characters who could be Canadian, etc. Would that be an impediment? Would that become something that makes it more difficult for the co-production to happen?
Well, yeah, it would be. I mean, but let's say if it's a production that comes from here and someone, and this is not something that I heard, but it could be, let's say it's a genre film. It's horror or whatever, so it could be set anywhere. It happens to be shot here. It actually would be good to shoot it here because you have fantastic facilities for shooting and they're very cost effective, so it would be good. So then, you know, what you'd have to think about is, you know, what would be the Canadian contribution? Well, the Canadian contribution in that case could be, you know, could be certainly doing some post in Canada, maybe contributing some of the key department heads, probably, you know, some cast. But really, I personally prefer to start a co-production earlier on, you know, like so, you know, so that it would be an idea, a seed, and then to say, okay, now how do we make this Canadian? You know? So we, you know, we need a script, you know, like start with the script and with the director, because if you're going to do a co-production that makes sense in both countries, especially films that would be, you know, smaller films, like Blindness was easier. I mean, it's hard to do, but in a way it was easier because you're talking about Fernando Morales, you know, so who's going to argue with you, you know? But if we're talking about, you know, emerging filmmakers or filmmakers from here that are not as well known internationally, or from Canada, you know, it'd be really great to combine a Canadian director with a Colombian writer, or a Colombian director with a Canadian writer, or if you start at that level, then you've already set your co-production on a co-production path right from the start. And then you can't miss, you know, like in a way that's the best way to do it, and guarantee that it would have, you know, a participation from both sides.
Now, in terms of the financing available in Canada, there is, on the one hand, obviously institutional financing for the Canada Media Fund and the Canada Feature Film Fund on behalf of that from Telefilm. But there's also as well very interesting tax incentives more attached to the regions, and those are connected to sort of incentives on Canadian labor, etc. Can you tell us a little bit about that and the advantages of shooting in Canada?
Sure, yes. There are actually two kinds of tax credits, we call them. There are federal tax credits that are given, you know, wherever you shoot in Canada. They're administered by the federal government, so it's equal for the whole country. Or there are tax credits. Each of the provinces has tax credits. Actually, some of them don't now, so be careful, because it's not every jurisdiction in Canada has them. You know, Ontario and where I live, and Quebec especially, and Manitoba, and some of the Atlantic provinces all have tax credits, and some of them are really competitive. Manitoba, for example, which is where Winnipeg is, it's in the center of Canada, has tax credits that amount to 50% of the labor costs in Manitoba. So it's really can be very attractive to shoot there. And that goes on top of everything else. And some of the provinces have also film funds that give money to specific projects. Those funds tend to be limited. So and the same with Telefilm's funds. You know, of course, the main concern of all the film funds, including Telefilm, is to service Canadian productions and Canadian directors, and of course you can imagine there's all those funds are extremely competitive in that area. But I mean, the fact that Carole is here and Telefilm has a presence here means, you know, is affirmation that Telefilm is always looking for co-production partners, and certainly Latin America has been designated as a place that they would like to do business in. So don't think that I don't want to say that the doors are wide open for everyone to come and get money in Canada. It's not quite that, but definitely there's a lot of will for welcoming people, especially if it comes in a way like I described, where it's a true co-production, and then there's the more of a true co-production, meaning culturally significant on both sides, and especially from the Canadian side, culturally significant from Canada's perspective, the more chance there is that there could be significant funds that are given from Canada.
Okay. In terms of other sources of financing in Canada, I suppose there are possibilities of advance from sales agents. Are there pre-sales to televisions? How do you build the rest of financing?
Well, in order to even apply to Telefilm Canada, you must have a distribution deal in place, and they tend to these days look a lot at what they call the market participation. They want to know that a project has enough market interest from a distributor that it would merit. They want to know that the film is going to be seen, essentially. So if you have a $5 million project and you get a very small advance from a distributor, that's not a very good indication of their interest in the project, because basically the theory is that money speaks. So the higher it is, the better it is. So generally, I would say 10% of the financing from a distributor is on the high side, but you could, for smaller projects up to 5 million, you can expect up to that amount. Once it gets higher than that, then it doesn't go. If you have a $15 million project, you wouldn't necessarily get a 1.5 million from a distributor. It kind of goes down a bit, but the scale slides down as opposed to up. But definitely you get some money. You have to get some money from a Canadian distributor, or else it doesn't qualify for Telefilm anyway. And then on top of that, we have television in Canada is strange, interesting, because it's not. It's traditionally television has not participated that much in the movie industry as much as in most other countries, and I guess the reason is because there's been so many other different sources of financing that television has never been forced to. I think in many countries, television is mandated to support cinema, and they have to whether they like it or not. And so in Canada, it hasn't been quite that, because there have been other agencies like Telefilm, like the National Film Board, and like the CMF that you said, the Canada Media Fund, which funds television productions, and all those agencies give money over and above the television stations themselves. So they haven't been as active financially in Canadian film. But yes, there are two pay stations that are kind of like our HBO that occasionally they certainly give pre-licenses for films, and occasionally they give advances on or some equity participation on film. Blindness, for example, had a very significant participation from one of them. And that's basically it. Private financing is pretty dead, because there's so many other. We have gotten it before, but it's pretty hard to get, and then it's hard for recoupment, and so it tends to not be quite as prominent a source of financing as in other places.
Now, one of the things you mentioned, that the requirement to have a distribution agreement in place when you apply for Telefilm Canada, and therefore I understand to apply for co-production status. How difficult is it to obtain a distribution agreement, particularly for a Latin American film? I assume that there are not necessarily a huge number of films from Latin America being distributed.
Yeah, it can be a challenge for sure. And especially now, because our two biggest companies, which were Alliance and E1, have just merged into one. E1 bought Alliance, so that just happened this year. So we're still trying to figure out the impact of that in terms of how supportive they're going to be of Canadian films. Canadian films get made though, so yeah, eventually, there are other distributors, and Telefilm recognizes a lot of other distributors, and of course, all the other producers who are here are from, I think most of them are from Montreal, and so I'm talking really mostly about the English side, but Montreal and Quebec is its own industry, and it's way stronger than ours, and has a much stronger connection to its audience than we do, and so they have their infrastructure is more healthy. I mean, it's still, I think if you ask any of them, they would say it's terribly weak and it's horrible, but it's still better than ours, I think.
Wow. Now, in terms of the distribution, anything you can tell us a little bit about how because Canada is a very large country geographically, but the population is not as big. So in fact, it's in terms of distribution is a relatively small country, I would say, and particularly with the cousin below, which somehow seems to take up a great part of the market share.
Yeah, it's a challenge, and as I say, French films connect to their audiences on a completely different level than English films, because English films face direct competition from American films, and also American distributors in Canada. The studios, the majors, have been in Canada since 1911, I think. So Canada is actually considered part of the U.S. domestic territory. It's we are not even our own territory. So, the majors operate in Canada as they do in the U.S. It's basically just an extension. So we really face a lot of stiff competition, and I think that's actually the reason for telefilm being there is to work on keeping some kind of a voice in Canadian cinemas. And you're right, it is a challenge. It's a huge country, and the population of the entire country, which is the second largest country in terms of landmass in the world, is smaller than Colombia. So, we have some economic strength, but we're still population-wise very, very small, and we're divided into two cultures, and it's not just language; it's completely different cultures. If you take each of those cultures separately, we're very, very small countries.
Okay, I think we could go on to The Boy Who Smelled Like Fish, because I think it could be a good case study for a co-production that somehow worked with a Latin American country. It is true it's Mexico, so it's a different financing structure on the part of the Mexican side. But tell us a little bit how that came about, how that project came to you, and how you made it culturally relevant to Canada as well.
If any of you were there last night, I don't like repeating myself, but just very briefly, one day I received a package in the mail, and it was a styrofoam box, and it was very scruffy and dirty. And when you open it up, it was kind of all newspapers and wrapped, and it had a really bad odor. And as you reach through the newspapers, it looked like a fish shipment, and it smelled like fish. And then when finally there was one newspaper that kind of looked like actually a fish, but you open it up, it was a folded up script. And you open that up, and it was called The Boy Who Smells Like Fish. So it was this conceptual masterpiece that made it extremely difficult not to read. Because I get a lot of scripts, as I'm sure you do, and generally you do everything possible to procrastinate and not read them until the person politely asks you several times, and then finally, you, out of pure shame, you read the scripts. And in this case, it kind of was easier, because I thought, oh, these people must be very brilliant. And so we read the script, and it was a beautiful script, and it was set in Canada, but it was a story that was, I thought, had a Mexican heart.
Who sent you the script? The screenwriter, the director?
The screenwriter and director who at the time were living in Spain, but they were, and the screenwriter is actually Spanish. But they sent it together with there was like a producer attached, but basically they just thought they wanted to make this film in Canada. And I mean, the backstory is that they originally wrote the script in Spanish to be set in Spain, in fact, but then they decided that they should turn it to English and set it in Canada, because they were smart, because they knew that Canada could actually provide a home for it, and if they set it in Canada, it's exactly what I was saying. It's like they made it easy for me to think, oh, okay, well, I could actually be involved in this, because the whole thing is set in Canada, and I can make it, as much as Canadian as we need to in order to get it through the system.
But when you got the script, the they were open to setting it in Canada, but it had not yet been adapted.
No, it was set in Canada.
Oh, already.
It read like a Canadian script in perfect English. They have this fantastic translator that they use in Madrid, and yeah, it was completely flawless English. It read like an original English screenplay, and it was that sweet story. And at the time, I was starting to work with a lot of first-time filmmakers. It was about 5 years or 6, I don't know, a while back. And I just thought, I just finished working on Blindness, I think, which is such a massive thing, and then the whole world crashed in 2008, and I thought, we got to start something different. And so I was looking to making smaller films and also helping younger filmmakers make their films, and so most of them were Canadians, but I thought, well, of course, because I'm always doing work everywhere, this was kind of a perfect fit for this program that I was making up to work with young filmmakers. And I met Annalene Calimayor, who is the director, and she was just super lovely and very open, and herself had been all over the world. She studied she came from the art cinema side and studied in Germany and in India and all over, and was very, very worldly. And her writing partner was, I thought, was brilliant. In fact, I hired him again to write the next Saramago adaptation, which is coming out now. We just finished the film. It's called Enemy, and it's coming out at TIFF. So both of them are great collaborators, and so I thought, yeah, we got to do this.
So at that point, you decided to go into the production, to get involved in the production. I don't know if you continued the development of the script or then, and decided initially, you told me, to set it as a co-production with Spain as well.
That's right, because they're living in Spain at the time. So we thought to do it as a Spanish co-production, and we kind of got a certain way, a certain distance with that. But Spain is very hard these days, as I'm learning, because actually Enemy is also a Spanish co-production. And in the end, the TV funds that they thought they were going to get ended up not materializing, and we were kind of stuck. And so we kind of picked up the pieces and went to Mexico, and because Annalene is Mexican, and because the story is Mexican, so it made more sense actually for it to be kind of the heart of it is Mexican. That character, Garibay, is so Mexican, is such a cheesy Mexican character, and kind of modeled after Jose or somebody, who, by the way, we went to visit in his home in Miami and took, that home is kind of a reference from his actual home. And he's a super lovely, generous, hilarious person, who has an absolute great sense of humor about himself. And so, so anyway, we immediately found a home for it in Mexico, and a Mexican producer, which is Red Room. His name is, the film company is Red Room, and his name is Stacy Persky, and we kind of set it up as a co-production in Mexico.
Now, I don't know if you want to go into so much detail, but can you give us a fair idea of sort of the budget? How was the financial structure?
Sure. The budget was just between 4 and 5. I think it was 4.5, somewhere in that level. We ended up shooting
4.5 Canadian?
Canadian, yeah, which is basically the same as US. And we ended up shooting most of the film, like 80% of it, or 85% of it in Canada. The only thing we shot in Mexico, we were originally going to do a split of all shooting in Canada and all post in Mexico, but then it didn't work out for the financial split, for the amount of money that we can raise in Mexico. So we needed to, because the rules in Mexico are that the money that you raise there, you must spend a certain amount, I forget, like 80% of it in Mexico. So the numbers didn't quite match, so we had to move some of the shoot to Mexico, and we ended up taking the whole swimming pool section, which is quite recurrent in the film, and we found this beautiful Art Deco pool, and shot all that stuff in Mexico City, which was terrific. We were all in one location, so we didn't have to battle through the traffic, but so we never had to move.
I assume you found then initially the local distributor in Canada?
Yes, we had a distributor in Canada, which was Alliance, right from the start. So they had to read the script and like it and approve it, and they met Anna Lane, and they treated it like absolutely like a local Canadian film. She met with them a lot, and we discussed the way they would market the film and everything, the same way that we discuss all our own films.
What was the split in co-production?
The split was, I think it was around 60-40.
60-40.
On Canada to Mexico. Yeah. And what we did is, through IMCINE, they have a fund that is so it's a diversion of taxes, so you can find an individual or a corporation that could pledge up to a certain percentage of, I think up to 10% of their tax that they're committed to pay in that particular year. They can pledge it to cinema, to a cinema financing, up to 20 million pesos, which is around $2 million. So my idea was to find a Canadian company that would be able to do that. So it just so happened that at that time, the Canadian ambassador to Mexico was a friend of mine, because he used to be the ambassador to Brazil when we were doing Blindness. And so I called him up and I asked if he would host a reception in his official residence for all the Canadian business community in Mexico City, and we'd make a presentation about the film, and then maybe someone would do it. So he did, and he had this fantastic party, and these guys from this company called Gold Corp, it's a gold mine that runs the largest gold mines in Mexico, and actually a very progressive company, and they stepped up and said, yeah, we'll do this, and then it has to go through IMCINE, and they have to approve it through committee, and then once they approve it, these guys sent us a check for 20 million pesos. Like, it was crazy.
That's right. Okay, now that, as I said, that's a very good example of a project that came about, as you say, that was culturally relevant on both sides. It had both a Canadian and a Mexican soul, and that luckily did manage to find all the necessary players and things to come through. We're going to watch now the trailer of the film, because I think a lot of the people here may not have seen it last night.
Sure. Yep.
For babies to have certain body odors we're not accustomed to.
He smells like
Fish.
Dad?
Yeah?
Why do I stink?
You don't stink.
1968, when Guillermo Garibay moved here. You can take a picture if you want. He refuses to leave the bathroom. I think he figured out that's the only place he doesn't smell.
He lived here from 1968 to 1975.
You the guy?
Uh-huh.
I've known you for 13 years. That smile on your face is scary.
You worry about me even when I'm happy.
It's a girl.
What girl?
That smile on your face.
What smile on me?
That.
Hey! You're a really good swimmer.
Trimethylaminuria. That's what you got. It's known as fish odor syndrome. You'll be happy to know it's a very rare disease.
So happy. Change my diet. That's all I can do. I don't see any bright side.
It helps to have answers.
It helps to confirm I'm a fucking freak.
I've told you so many times, we all have our little quirks. And it is those quirks that make each of us unique.
try and live in a normal house one day.
Oh, I love your house. It's unique.
Well, that film is yet to open, so best of luck with it, and
Thank you.
we'll keep watching. So now, focusing back on Colombia, and before we open up for questions, we've spoken sort of generally about what would be your recommendations to a Colombian producer and or filmmaker when approaching a Canadian producer and when trying to find those elements in the story that may make their story accessible to a Canadian audience?
Well, I mean, I think you know, there's no, I don't want to give a guideline to what it should be creatively, because it should be up to anyone to, you know, who would think that that would be Canadian, but it ended up being very Canadian, you know. So, I mean, stories are universal, and so it could be any story that you know, that can have a participation for both countries. So, you know, I think it should be quite open. The only thing is to not make it so Colombian, and to have all the elements already in place. So, you know, you already come with a, you know, a writer, director, the cameraman, this, and you want to do the post here and everything, and then you basically are saying, I need money for my film. You know, that's just a whole different kind of approach. And, you know, you could do that with possibly with a, you know, with a sales agent, or with somebody who can, you know, buy rights for the film, a very Colombian film for the world. But if you want to do it as a co-production, you have to keep it open on both sides.
Or then let me turn the question around a bit. As a Canadian producer, what may be, from what you've seen of Colombia, or from what you may have read or understood, I know you've been traveled a little bit, what have you found attractive about Colombia that thinks could be appealing in that sense?
Well, for me, if I were to propose a project here, I would do it, you know, about possibly about a Canadian character that comes here, you know, comes here in search of love, or comes here in search of solitude. You know, you could do something. You could do something more political, of course. You know, there's a story of one of our diplomats that I've always kept in the back of my head, who was actually one of the people that was assigned to negotiate one of the treaties in the jungle, and that I think could be a fantastic film, would be a great Colombian-Canadian co-production, because the lead character would be Canadian, but it's actually a completely Colombian story, and yet it's very Canadian in the sense that we always think of ourselves as, you know, diplomats and, you know, involved in sort of mediation in the world, and so it would sell really well in Canada in that sense, but it's actually a completely Colombian story. So something like that, or you know, any of your literature, you know, you know, you're the kings of that, you know, that somehow could be with a Canadian director, for example, you know, that kind of thing. I think it could be anything, you know. So it's hard to limit it, you know, because the imagination is just so wild.
Good. Well, we also hope, and in that sense, obviously, we're picking your brain. So, so a lot of the questions have gone so much about Canada, but obviously, one of the purposes here is as well to attract Canadian producers to think of Colombia as a place to shoot. Yeah. And so we hope that we may inspire you to, with the many stories and, as you say, the wonderful literature that abounds here. We're going to open up for questions now to the audience. If we can put up the lights a bit.
Bueno, entonces está abierta el micrófono para que hagan preguntas. ¿Quién quiere mandarse? Los dejaste sin palabras.
You got.
Ok. Bueno.
You've done such a good job. That no, you ask all the questions. You ask everything that anyone wanted to know.
Okay. Bueno, tenemos una pregunta aquí atrás.
You talked about the fact that Canada and the United States in many ways are treated as one market historically. In the future, today and forward, where is the digital platforms fitting in your judgment, to the taste and to the trends of film viewers' eyeballs in Canada as far as distribution versus theatrical attendance?
Well, what I talked about was that from the American studio perspective, you know, that they treat Canada as just the same as they would treat Colorado. But yeah, the digital world, it scares the hell out of me, and I'm really glad I'm really old so I can retire soon before it really takes over. But you know, even some of the smaller films that we're working on now that have just been released, and I'm sure this one, you know, will probably find more of its audience digitally than in the cinemas. You know, a film I just finished a couple years ago, a film called Hobo with a Shotgun, which was kind of the, believe it or not, the brother of this, because they started around the same time, and now it couldn't be more different. It's a gore / blood and guts kind of film with Rutger Hauer, and you know, in the States, it was released by Magnolia, you know, day and date with VOD, and of course, most of its audience was on VOD. So you know, I think it really has to do with the films themselves, and I think we'll start to delineate more, not only subject matter and level of film, but kind of the designated release pattern. And I think even telefilm is starting to recognize that as a, you know, telefilm was always measuring success based on pure theatrical box office, but now, you know, they're starting to recognize other forms of release as legitimate, you know, because they're the only way to get films released. And I think it's fantastic, actually, that there's so many different ways to see movies, and that, you know, it's yet another way that films have reinvented themselves, as they did first of all with, you know, television, and with, remember, good old VHS tapes, and then, you know, DVDs, and now VOD, and then, you know, various digital platforms that God knows where we'll end up. So I can see myself even now, like, you know, in the next few years, you know, producing films that are specifically geared only for a certain kind of release that wouldn't even necessarily see cinema. You know, we're starting to fight. This is the first film, The Boy Smells Like Fish, where we successfully won the right to not deliver 35 mil elements, believe it or not. And we don't even remember 35 mil anymore, but yet in most distribution contracts, you need to deliver 35 mil, and it's a, you know, all the labs are closed. You can't even, I'm sure you go through this all the time. It's like, you can't even get labs to print 35 anymore, let alone, you know, for anyone to see it. But it's the first time, and even with this new Saramago film, Enemy, like, there's no way we couldn't win that fight, because there's too big a film, and there's still apparently certain cinemas that are not equipped to show digital. But that's going to go very soon, and then we're off, you know. So.
Bueno, tenemos una pregunta aquí y luego allá, y ya vamos para esa zona. Ahí.
Hi, I'm Steven Grisales from Rayuela Films.
Qué pena. Puedes levantarte para la gente en el...
Canada is well known for having one of the better politics for dealing with other countries. How would you feel about making a film that doesn't talk that well about what Canadians do abroad? And how will that film will be seen for the Canadian institutions?
Well, I think that if it's the truth, then Canadians will probably accept it if it's told, if it's a good film and it's well told. I think we're pretty open to, we're pretty democratic place. So and we have very, very free press. So we're used to hearing lots of bad stories about ourselves. Unfortunately, there are some. We like to think of ourselves as good, but that's why I'm wearing all white today. But of course, like every country, we have our dark side as well. So if it's a good, and most important is it's going to be a good film, and if it's well told and it's very emotional, then I'm sure that it would be considered in Canada. But it would be a good basis for a co-production because it's Canadian.
Tenemos una pregunta allá y luego acá.
Hi, my name is Andres. I'm composer. I'm just curious about one thing. For example, in the Red Violin, did you hire John Corigliano because of his agent, because of his talent, or because of a co-production? Well, I'm just curious.
Sorry, what was the choices? Because of its agent?
Of his agent, his talent, his personal talent, or it was a co-production with the US, or how does it work there?
No, actually, he was a problem to the co-production because he was an American composer, and the co-production doesn't really allow, we have to really justify why we would hire somebody who's not Italian or Canadian because it was an Italian-Canadian co-production. We hired him because I think he's probably one of the greatest living composers, and because we worked very closely with, in those days, with Sony Classical, the record label, not Sony Classics, the film label, but Sony Classical was the record label that was responsible for, putting out all the classical music, and they took over Colombia, and so had a huge catalog of different classical music artists, and we worked a lot with them. And the guy who used to run it, his name is Peter Gelb, he now runs the Metropolitan Opera in New York, but he had a really huge vision for film soundtracks, and he really was interested in this project, and he proposed Corigliano, and I knew Corigliano from my previous life as a classical music filmmaker, and I knew his previous work, and I thought it would be an amazing honor to work with him, in the same way as it is an amazing honor to work with a book by Saramago, it's a kind of that level. And so we got the exception because of who he was. And he worked on the film right from the start before we started shooting because, of course, he had to compose some of the music before, because you see it being played. So it had to be already composed and recorded. It was very complicated. So it had to be recorded beforehand, and only then, after the film was edited, did he actually score the music based on his own themes that he wrote beforehand.
Okay, tenemos una última pregunta aquí.
Hi, Niv.
Te puedes poner de... Gracias.
Nice to meet you. My name is Carolina Herrera from Bacti Films, and my question is regarding language in terms of requirements, limitations, if we were to think of a co-production. And it's something like that main character comes from Canada and has a complete different experience in Colombia. Is there any kind of limitation to the language in terms of accessing grants from Canada?
Well, the treaty between Colombia and Canada says that the films can be in the languages of the two countries. So the films can be in English, French, or any of our native languages, and Spanish as well, because that's your language. So the film can qualify as a co-production with any of those languages, including Spanish. Telefilm Canada has a policy that supports films only in English and French and the native Canadian languages because of just limitation of funds. I've been trying to get them to change that policy for a long time. So your question is kind of hitting, a little sore spot right now. But in fairness to them, there's, a massive demand on very, very limited funds. And so if you open it up to Spanish, then you'd open it up essentially to any language of any of the 53 co-production countries. So it could be, I don't know how many languages that is, but probably another, if you count some of the Asian countries that have many languages, it could be 100 more languages. So it would be kind of unmanageable. So I can see why there's that restriction. So unfortunately, in terms of accessing money from Telefilm, the film has to be in English or French. And I learned, just a little side story, I learned that story the hard way because I was the original producer of the film No, the Chilean film. It is, in fact, I was the one who kind of set that whole film up and introduced the playwright of, the author to the director, and Gael Garcia Bernal, who was in Blindness, to the director. Like, I was the one, and then realized that I couldn't be the producer of it because I didn't know that rule existed. So Telefilm couldn't fund it because it was in Spanish. So I learned a big, a big lesson because of that. But anyway, that's the way it goes right now. And as with everything, they're very open to listening to people's opinions, and so it might change one day. But it doesn't mean that you wouldn't have access to any of the other funds, like the tax credits, and all of those go with a co-production. And theoretically, a Canadian distributor can give money against a Spanish language film, although would be more limited because it'd be a subtitled film in Canada. But there's no restriction that way. The only rule restriction is that their mandate says that they only can fund films in Canadian languages.
So that means the theatrical film fund is the one that can only fund in English or French.
Yeah, and I believe CMF as well, right?
No, the CMF as part of their funding for other languages. And I would make just a small comment on your previous. Part of the film can be shot in another language.
That's true, yeah.
To get funding from Telefilm, but the majority of it has to be either in French, English, or Aboriginal language. But part of the film, up to 40%, I would say, could be shot in another language.
Yeah, and they don't measure by word. They're pretty lax that way, so yeah. So if it's in the spirit of basically being more of an English or a French film, then it can work.
Just wanted to point out that in any case, the Telefilm Canada website does have, in fact, a booklet of guidelines that you can download, and that explains all of the requirements and such for co-productions.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias, Michel. Niv, un aplauso, por favor. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I just want to thank you so much for that. And you know that we could do exactly the opposite because he's got as much of things to say or more and with his history. So maybe at TIFF we should do the opposite, where I could interview you and you could talk about all the fantastic things. So I'm really honored that you took the time to do this. Thank you.
Bueno, muchas gracias de nuevo.